The Israel-Palestine conflict is often perceived through different lenses. For Christians, it represents spiritual war rooted in ancient prophecies and divine promises, while politicians see it as a territorial and nationalist struggle. Regardless of perspective, it remains one of the most enduring and complex disputes in human history. To truly understand it, we must dive into the origins of this enmity, tracing it back to biblical events, prophecies, and the real-world developments that have shaped this rivalry over the centuries. The roots of the conflict date back thousands of years to the Bible's account of Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham, revered as the patriarch by both Jews and Arabs, was promised by God that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. This divine promise, however, became the source of division. Abraham had two sons, Ishmael, born to Hagar, an Egyptian slave, and Isaac, born to his wife Sarah in their old age. According to the Bible, God's covenant would pass through Isaac and his descendants, making him the forefather of Jacob, whose descendants became the Israelites. This divine promise of land and blessing to Isaac's lineage is central to the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. Yet, Ishmael also received a blessing from God to become the father of a great nation, which many understand to represent the Arab people, including Palestinians. This ancestral division underpins the conflict, as both Jews and Arabs claim Abraham as their forefather, and view the land of Canaan as part of their heritage. For Jews, the land represents not only a place to live, but the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which grants their descendants an everlasting inheritance of Canaan, the area encompassing modern-day Israel and Palestine. This promise appears throughout the Old Testament, reaffirmed in God's covenants with Moses and King David. Biblical prophecies also foretell Israel's restoration in the end times, with passages in Ezekiel and Isaiah describing a future where Israel regathers and is restored to its land. For many, the establishment of Israel in 1948 marked the beginning of these prophecies coming to fruition, following the Holocaust and centuries of exile. For Palestinians, however, the land is equally a part of their ancestral identity, with many tracing their lineage to Ishmael or viewing themselves as descendants of the ancient Canaanites and other historical groups that inhabited the region. Having lived in the area for centuries, Palestinians feel a profound connection to the land. This tension over rightful ownership adds complexity to a dispute that is not merely political, but touches on identity, faith, and historical rights. The creation of Israel in 1948 marked a turning point in the conflict. For Jewish people, it symbolized the fulfillment of prophecies and the restoration of their homeland after centuries of persecution, including the horrors of the Holocaust. For Palestinians, however, it was a moment of profound loss, marked by displacement and hardship. This event, known to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, sparked a lasting crisis that intensified their sense of dispossession and fueled the struggle for recognition and a homeland. The roots of the modern conflict lie in the late 19th century with the emergence of the Zionist movement, which aimed to establish a Jewish homeland in response to centuries of persecution in Eastern Europe and Russia. Palestine at that time was under Ottoman rule, with a predominantly Arab Muslim population and smaller Jewish and Christian communities. The Zionist movement viewed Palestine as the Jewish people's historic homeland, based on biblical claims and historical ties. By the early 1900s, Jewish immigration to Palestine was on the rise, driven by both Zionist aspirations and the escalating dangers for Jews in Europe. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. While this statement fueled Jewish hopes, it also planted seeds of tension with the Arab inhabitants, who saw it as a betrayal of promises made to them for support against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. After the war, Britain assumed control over Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, and tensions between Jews and Arabs continued to escalate as Jewish immigration and land purchases increased through the 1920s and 1930s. During this period, Arab nationalism grew as a counter-movement to Zionism, leading to occasional violent clashes between the communities. The outbreak of World War II and the Holocaust only strengthened the Zionist cause, as the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews left the survivors with a fierce determination to create a safe homeland. After the war, large numbers of Jewish refugees, including Holocaust survivors, sought to immigrate to Palestine. However, the British, facing both Arab opposition and geopolitical pressures, imposed limits on Jewish immigration, leading to violent protests by Jewish paramilitary groups. Exhausted, Britain ultimately referred the matter to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan to resolve the rising violence, suggesting two separate states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration. Although Jews made up only about 30% of the population and owned less than 10% of the land, the plan awarded them a majority of the territory, which Arab leaders rejected as unjust. Jewish leaders accepted it reluctantly, seeing it as their best opportunity to establish a state. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate ended, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of Israel. The next day, neighboring Arab countries invaded, marking the beginning of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. This war was a triumph for Israel, but a catastrophe for Palestinians, over 700,000 of whom were displaced, many becoming permanent refugees. While Israel framed the conflict as a struggle for survival, Palestinians saw it as a tragedy that led to statelessness, loss of their homes, and an enduring refugee crisis. The 1949 armistice that ended the war left Israel in control of 78% of historic Palestine, with Jordan controlling the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egypt governing Gaza. The Nakba remains a core grievance for Palestinians, who continue to seek acknowledgement of their rights and the right to return to their former homes. The events of 1948 created two powerful national narratives, one of victory and restoration for Jews and one of dispossession and loss for Palestinians. These stories, tied to each side's identity, add profound difficulty to any peace efforts. The Six-Day War of 1967 further complicated the landscape. Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, achieving a decisive victory and capturing the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The result was a dramatic change in the region's geography, with Israel tripling its territory in just 6 days. For Palestinians and the Arab world, it marked the beginning of Israel's occupation of territories still central to their demands for statehood and autonomy. The capture of East Jerusalem was especially significant, as it brought the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, under Israeli control. For Palestinians, however, it was a devastating loss, as East Jerusalem includes the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, two of Islam's holiest sites. The occupation also exacerbated the Palestinian refugee crisis, as hundreds of thousands more were displaced. The continued Israeli presence in these territories remains one of the most contentious issues in the conflict. Since the Six-Day War, Israel's strategic position has been bolstered by international alliances, especially with the United States. Although initially neutral, the United States increasingly aligned with Israel during the Cold War, providing significant financial, military, and diplomatic support. This alliance further altered the balance of power in the region, reinforcing Israel's military capabilities while complicating relationships with neighboring Arab states. Although the United Nations calls for a peaceful resolution, the legacy of these events and the competing narratives of Jews and Palestinians make finding a mutually acceptable solution extraordinarily challenging. The enduring memory of these wars, particularly 1948 and 1967, continues to shape perspectives, fueling a cycle of resentment, identity, and national ambition that complicates any pathway to lasting peace. In the decades following the Six-Day War, peace efforts were initiated but were consistently thwarted by mutual distrust, competing visions, and violence. The 1973 Yom Kippur War marked a turning point when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Although Israel ultimately repelled the invasion, the conflict exposed its vulnerabilities and highlighted the cost of the ongoing occupation. In the aftermath, both Israel and its neighbors reconsidered the feasibility of a lasting peace. This reevaluation led to the Camp David Accords in 1978, brokered by United States President Jimmy Carter. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the accords, leading to a peace treaty in which Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. While this was a significant breakthrough, providing Egypt with the first Arab recognition of Israel, it did not address Palestinian grievances, and Sadat's overture to Israel isolated him from other Arab leaders. For Palestinians, frustration continued to mount, especially among those living under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. By the 1980s, the situation had reached a boiling point, leading to the First Intifada in 1987. This uprising, characterized by widespread protests, strikes, and clashes with Israeli forces, drew global attention to the Palestinian cause. Unlike previous conflicts, the Intifada was a grassroots movement, with civilians, particularly youth, taking the lead in the struggle against Israeli control. Israel's response was met with international criticism, while the uprising spotlighted the Palestinian demand for independence. The Intifada also led to a shift within the Palestinian leadership. Previously, the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, focused on armed struggle, but the Intifada pushed the PLO to adopt a more diplomatic approach. In 1988, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and endorsed a two-state solution, signaling a willingness to pursue peace. These developments culminated in the Oslo Accords in 1993, a landmark agreement brokered by U.S. President Bill Clinton, in which Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands on the White House lawn. Oslo established a framework for peace, creating the Palestinian Authority and granting limited self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. It also laid out a roadmap for further negotiations on critical issues, including borders, refugees, security, and Jerusalem. While Oslo generated hope, the peace process quickly encountered obstacles. The agreement faced opposition from hardliners on both sides, with Israeli settlers and right-wing politicians fearing it would lead to a divided Jerusalem and the dismantling of settlements, while Palestinian groups like Hamas rejected the idea of recognizing Israel. In 1995, Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist, a devastating blow to the peace process. Subsequent leaders struggled to build on Oslo's foundation as violence periodically flared and mistrust grew. In 2000, peace efforts reached another turning point with the Camp David summit, where U.S. President Bill Clinton invited Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Arafat to negotiate a final agreement. While progress was made, the summit ultimately failed, with each side blaming the other for intransigence. Shortly afterward, the Second Intifada erupted, marked by intensified violence and suicide bombings. Unlike the first, this Intifada saw widespread attacks on Israeli civilians, prompting a severe military response. Over 5 years, thousands of lives were lost, and both communities were left more polarized. During the Second Intifada, Israel began constructing a barrier separating it from parts of the West Bank, citing security concerns. The wall, which diverged from the pre-1967 borders in certain areas, was seen by Palestinians as a land grab, exacerbating tensions. Israel also unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005, dismantling settlements and redeploying its military. However, this did not bring peace, as Gaza soon fell under the control of Hamas, an Islamist group that rejects Israel's right to exist and has engaged in repeated conflicts with it. The split between Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank further fractured Palestinian politics, complicating efforts to present a unified front in peace negotiations. Since then, numerous attempts to revive the peace process have faltered. Efforts led by U.S. administrations, including George W. Bush's Roadmap for Peace and John Kerry's negotiations under President Obama, yielded no breakthroughs. The ongoing expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, deemed illegal under international law, has reduced the prospect of a contiguous Palestinian state, while periodic outbreaks of violence, particularly in Gaza, have hardened attitudes on both sides. Today, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains a deeply entrenched struggle that eludes resolution. While some Israelis and Palestinians still believe in a two-state solution, others advocate alternative paths, from a single binational state to autonomy within a confederation. The growing role of religion in politics on both sides adds a new layer of complexity, with some Israeli leaders seeing the conflict as a battle for biblical lands and Palestinian leaders framing it as a defense of Islamic holy sites. The role of international actors also complicates the path forward. The United States remains Israel's strongest ally, providing billions in military aid and supporting its security interests. Meanwhile, many European and Arab nations call for a two-state solution, advocating for Palestinian statehood based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. However, regional dynamics are changing, with recent normalization agreements between Israel and Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain reshaping alliances and potentially sidelining the Palestinian issue in broader Middle Eastern geopolitics. Despite the diplomatic stalemate, there are grassroots movements on both sides working toward peace. Organizations like Seeds of Peace and Combatants for Peace bring together Israelis and Palestinians to foster understanding and dialogue. These efforts underscore the hope that, beneath the political impasse, there is a shared desire among ordinary people to live in peace, free from violence and fear. Ultimately, resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict requires addressing the underlying issues of identity, history, and justice. Both sides need to acknowledge each other's narratives and rights, while leaders must exhibit the courage to make compromises. While the road to peace is uncertain and fraught with challenges, many continue to believe that a just and lasting resolution is possible, rooted in mutual recognition, respect, and coexistence.